I've heard a lot about cults, and I've talked to a lot of cult survivors on this show, but I do have to say that the cult you grew up in might take the cake for the most messed up craziness and the destructive nature of its practices.
And I think maybe that's part of why we don't talk about it more, honestly. People get very, very uncomfortable when you start talking about beliefs that included, religious prostitution and pedophilia for God. And even when I was trying to sell Uncultured, I had a lot of editors tell me, we don't do Children of God because it's too hard for readers.
Really?
And, it's an interesting parallel to we don't do books about women in the military because nobody reads them. And I was like, well,
have I got a book for you? It's about Children of God and women in the military. Your favorite combination of hard to read and not interesting enough to read, according to you, right?
And I think it's, bringing you behind those walls, right? We think we know what happens in cults. We think we know what happens to the Daughters of America when they disappear behind the commune walls of the Department of Defense. But we're not actually getting those full stories very often.
Yeah. Well, I did learn a lot from your book about both of those things. And first of all, let's just back up to your childhood, because that's kind of where we'll probably focus most of the show. Can you discuss the premise of the cult that you were in? I mean, you said pedophilia for God, and I think people were like, oh, come again? Because that phrase alone is pretty tough to swallow for, I think, most people. It's just like, you got to be exaggerating. I think that's where most people probably start when they hear this.
Yes, so it started in 1968, which, to put in context, this was the time of the hippies, right? The free love movement, and new religious movements were basically a dime a dozen. People were getting all into them. And so our leader, David Berg, was already this failed preacher who came out of evangelical Christian tradition and kind of found his spot with his teenage children recruiting hippies in California. And it started off love, faith, Jesus, very supposedly wholesome, right? Very much with this revolutionary, this is the prophet of God. We are living in the end of days, and we are on this mission to win the world for God. Over about a decade, it went from love, faith, Jesus to using his female followers as religious prostitutes. So based on this verse in Matthew, I will make you fishers of men. And they called themselves flirty fishing. They called themselves hookers for Christ.
Wow.
And it was very deliberate. You are going out and you are using your body and your sexuality to gain converts and to gain money. And he, first started with this concept of sexual control. And I think it's exactly what evangelical purity does, which is try to control you and your sexuality all through your life. And all he did was flip that and say, sex is love, love is God, and God loves everyone. And so the idea was free love. The result was forced polyamory, religious prostitution. And then when the kids came along, so my mother was one of the first children born into the cult, the kids got absorbed into this idea of raising sexually liberated children.
Oh, God. There's so much to unpack, and all of it is kind of gross. But let's, and I'm sure you don't mind me saying that, right? But
not at all.
I think religious prostitution, people are still probably like, okay, but what is it really? So what is it really? Because it's just like it sounds, which it's so hard to believe. And I was listening to the audiobook and I'm like, I got to rewind this. Did she actually just say that this is what was happening? Because there was a lot of stuff that was so unbelievable that I just wanted to make sure I heard it clearly. Because I'm often multitasking when I read. I'm working on a car or something, and I'm like, I gotta rewind this. Did she say that you have to share your wife with other guys in the cult? Okay, that's kind of culty, very not seemingly very Christian. And then it's like, but wait a minute, they are also literally prostituting themselves, and this is how they generate revenue or something for the cult. Can you explain this a little bit? Because that does not seem, I haven't read the Bible recently, but it's probably a stretch to find that in there.
So the whole, I guess, thing with cults is it hinges on your absolute belief in one concept, which in this case was that this man was the prophet of God. I think honestly, this is why they couldn't break me, because I never believed in this concept. And so I was just like, my whole life, right? These people are crazy. But once he's put his followers through this process of a decade, right, of isolation and of self-sublimation, because the other big thing about cults is you are asked to sublimate yourself, right, lower your individualism, make sacrifices in order for the good of the group and the ultimate mission. Mm-hmm. At which point, anything you start becoming asked to do seems reasonable because you're doing it for this mission, for this purpose, right? The ends justifies the means.
Right.
And so again, he walks his followers into it a little bit at a time. First, he sets his wife aside and takes a young wife and nobody says anything. Then he says everyone needs to start sharing sexually with each other. And then he says, well, what a great gift of love that the Lord has given us, right? These beautiful women and their beautiful bodies. And if this is God's way of bringing, men and money into the group, then all the better. And it, nobody ever called it religious prostitution. They called it their own thing. They gave it their own terminology, their own sort of thought-stopping cliche around it. And then it just became part of the fabric of the group.
And so thought-stopping cliche, the term might sound familiar from other cult episodes that we've done, which is when something seems entirely insane or out of line in some way with what a cult would know, wow, this person is going to run into this problem. Like your parents are going to try and get you out. They give you thought-stopping cliches in order to get you to drop logical thinking and just go into this sort of loop. And multi-level marketing companies or other sort of shady business ventures do it too, right? So when someone says, hey, you've spent a lot of money and you haven't made a lot of money, and I think you're being taken advantage of, it's like, oh, haters will say anything to get you out of the way of the success you're running into because they're jealous. So there's this sort of program in there that's like, hey, when you run into this very obviously credible objection from people that you trust, go into this thought-stopping cliche. So when your husband says, maybe I don't want my wife to be a prostitute because that was not something that we learned about at church, and also I really hate the feeling and she hates the feeling and we're all upset about it. It's, well, I assume the thought-stopping cliche was something like, don't resist. God's going to make you uncomfortable, but he's testing you. And this is just part of if you're not willing to share the love, that's something about you and not about the doctrine or the fact that your wife is on the streets generating revenue. It's a you problem, right? It's not a problem with what we're doing. We're always right because I'm the prophet of God. It's got to be something along those lines, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of how I would handle it.
No, you pegged it exactly, right? Yeah. They precede the field with, we have this big revelation. It's gonna be really difficult, right? Mm-hmm. We had this concept of the old church and the new church, right? We've left the old church and we are the new church of God. We are gonna have new revelations. It's going to be hard for you. And they tell you that. And so one of the things I've noticed is as adults, we buy into our own programming. You become the first one who shuts down your own doubts, right? You say, oh, I know I'm just going through doubts because it's so hard to share my spouse. And then the rest of the community says, yes, you're right. You just got to pray. We've all gone through this, right? And this feeling of being surrounded by people that look just like you and are confirming that think just like you and are confirming that the mission that you're on is correct. It's a really good feeling, and people like that, and they will do a lot to go along with their groups.
When the cult leader, was he your grandfather? Is that kind of how that worked?
No. So my great grandmother, if you research the Children of God, you will find that they had this big commune out in Texas. It's always Texas. And it's called the Soul Clinic, and everyone lived basically in near poverty. And the prophet lived in a very nice house nearby. So my great grandmother donated that house to him when her teenage daughter went off with my grandfather and joined the Children of God. So there were actually parents that thought this was great, right? My troubled child has found religion and is doing good things. And my grandfather was one of the few college educated people that joined. And so he quickly became kind of the CPA and in the finances, right at the prophet's right-hand side. So then when my mother is 13 years old, she ends up in a group wedding to the prophet, who's in his 70s. And it's 14 girls that range from 14 to the age of 3. It includes the prophet's granddaughter. And the 3-year-old's mother is the one running the ceremony. So this is like to just give you a range, right, of how it went from this good group of faith to 13 years later, 14 years later, these things are going on.
My God, I'm resisting. I don't even, okay. When something like that happens, I just want people to sort of pause and think about this, because when you look at it, when you're in a cult, right, you have thought-stopping cliches, you're doing things you wouldn't normally do. Imagine how far down the cult rabbit hole you have to be like, this is fine. A 3-year-old is marrying a 70-plus-year-old man. A bunch of teen girls that probably of course still look just like children are marrying this old man. This is fine. This isn't weird. You have to be so far down the brainwashing cult thinking rabbit hole to not be like, okay, I'm drawing the line. Prostituting yourself or your wife is weird and out there, but when you're starting to condone and give your own kids to a pedophile, you've really got to be fully enrolled in, like, you can't fake your way through that, right? Most 99% of people you'd think would draw the line somewhere before that, and they didn't.
Yes, you would think. And that is the thing I have come to find now with a lifetime of studying extremism, is that people really do think that there is one line and you will know before you cross it. And it isn't like that, right? It is a series of incremental, this woman who ran the wedding ceremony, she was a Dallas cheerleader. She was a normal woman before she got associated with this, right? As a seeker, an idealist. And so 50 years later, she still can't see the problem, right? And this is the same woman that you will read about in my book, in Children of God History, who, when the prophet decides to formalize his ideology about how we are going to sexually raise children, he uses his own stepson for this process to be documented. And she is the nanny. She is the woman that does this and writes this 762-page book, the Davidito book, which has been called the worst cult artifact of all times, which is this essentially manual on pedophilia for God.
Oh my gosh.
So kind of to your point of they really do. They go in so far. But it's increments at a time. It's a little bit at a time. And it's with so much ceremony. It's with so much ritual. And it's with so many other good people right around you that everything is reinforcing itself. And of course, for us children, right? So a year after this, at 14, my mom gets pregnant from the man who works with her father, who's older than her father. And, they're all the lieutenants of the prophet. And, that is with me, right? So when we start coming into this, my mom and me, we don't know anything different, right? So we are being programmed with this, and you go along with things because that's all you know.
Right. So you didn't have outside, because I think a lot of people are going, well, wait a minute. What did your friends at school think? Or what did the other kids that you grew up around think? Or what you had to know from watching TV that this wasn't normal? You just didn't have any of those influences.
None of it. So we grew up in really big communes. We had the one interaction that we had with the outside world is when we would be taken out to perform on the streets or to go to orphanages. I like to call it performing missionary work, right? So we would go to an orphanage, we would hand out toys, we would take photos, and then we would use those photos to raise more money. We would go out singing and dancing on the streets a lot in the 80s and 90s when the Children of God stopped with the sexual recruiting. They went headlong into the childhood entertainment business. And so many of us were these little kind of child trafficked actors. I call myself the little apocalypse Lindsay Lohan. And then we would sell these videos, millions and millions of them on the streets around the world. And so that was our only interaction with the outside world. We did not go to school. We did not see doctors except in the most emergencies. And we were, very, very separated. The first time I would see live television on would be on 9/11 when I was 14 years old.
Oh, wow. By the way, super creepy name. You think Children of God, wow, this is going to be a creepy cult. And then you read about it and you're like, wow, I did not sign up for that level of creepiness. It's really extra. And it's shocking that it's allowed to go on, right? That's, I think, what people are going, well, wait a minute, how is this even allowed to go on? Well, it started in Texas, but you didn't grow up in Texas, right? You grew up, where did you grow up?
Right. So I was born in the Philippines.
Okay.
And I grew up mostly in South America, Latin America, Brazil, and Mexico. So right around the mid 70s, when you've had Jonestown massacre happen, you've had Charles Manson stuff go on, our prophet is starting to realize like, oh, I need to get my people out of the United States. And so he conveniently gets revelations from God, that we need to be going into these developing nations and recruiting people and saving the world. And in many ways, on their part, this was really genius, because now you're going into countries where, you're talking Brazil, right? The slums of Brazil, the slums of India. Like, these are places where it's easy to recruit people into a better life. And even when they notice that things are really bad, in some ways, it's still not as bad as what they came from. So they're going to continue to stay. And because we're growing up with not in our home countries, right, with no knowledge of the legal system, no contact with the outside world. For my first 6 years in Brazil, I didn't even speak the language. We really are very, very isolated and also hidden just in plain sight all over the world.
Okay, so are there Brazilians joining the cult, or is it like, hey, we're going to move a bunch of white people out here because they're isolated, and the locals will just be like, it's a weird group of white people. They live behind this barbed wire fence. Who cares?
It was both. It was certainly, mainly Americans moving. They spread to, first went into Europe, but we see cults become really popular in times of social confusion and when systems are coming down and people are looking for guidance. And so globally, right, we saw it go 60s and 70s was America's time of cult, 80s was Asia, and then 90s was Latin America. And the Children of God, the family, another creepy name, they followed sort of that trajectory, just growing and growing in places that were friendly.
Huh. Why the 80s in Asia and the 90s in South America?
I think it just has to do with all the different political unrest and the things that were going on. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm curious because
I know that part, but I've only really studied American cults.
No, it makes sense because I'm curious. I'm thinking, okay, 80s in Asia, maybe there was I know there was some financial upheaval there was like an Asian market crash. I just don't know exactly when it was. I want to say early to mid 80s. In 90s, I'm thinking end of the Cold War messed up Latin America a little bit more because all the creepy, crappy governments the United States was propping up and the Soviets were propping up. We didn't have any need to do that anymore, and the Soviets couldn't do that anymore. And it was like, oh, let's have a bunch of upheaval. And there was like the Sandinistas, and there was the Sendero Luminoso in Peru, and all these sort of terrorist organizations and Marxist organizations that were throwing things up, kicking up dust, to put a nice euphemism on things. So maybe that's why. Because I guess if you're worried about getting murdered.
Yeah, we would be right behind all of those political things. Like when the Iron Curtain fell and when communism was coming down, the USSR and all that stuff, we were always some of the first ones in the country, to the point that I was warning people to be on the lookout in Ukraine, right? Like this Children of God is going to show up on the borders of these war-torn countries, right? Because this is where it's easy to sort of disappear people, right? To find people that are trying to leave whatever social system hasn't been looking for them or hasn't been working for them and fit into yours.
I want to hear more about that because, first of all, spoiler alert, the cult still exists, right? And it's all over the place. And you're thinking they're going to go to Ukraine because the system has fallen apart. And if you've got desperate refugees and you've got a place that says, hey, look, you can live in our barbed wire compound and the Russians can't get you and we're going to feed you and your kids are going to go to school, you just have to ignore the fact that you're going to have to prostitute your 14-year-old daughter to a bunch of old dudes. It's probably tempting because your alternative might be to die of starvation or get attacked by enemy troops, essentially, occupiers.
Exactly. And part of how the Children of God supports themselves is by, again, performing charity work, performing public service. So I'm going to now, in the US, be telling people that, oh, my missionary group is over here doing all of this great work on the Ukrainian border. And they're raising enough donations. Like 90% of the money and donations that we ever brought in stayed with us.
Sure.
Right. And so, and cults are always also out for political power. Right. So the Children of God performed twice at the George H.W. Bush White House.
Really? That's extra
And not
gross.
to mention, Donald Trump just spoke at the Moonies convention last year, right? So it serves two purposes of getting them funding and disciples, like on these war-torn political upheaval places, but it also helps them make connections into government and power.
Right, so it's a credibility play to have the founder. I know the Moonies, we talked to a former Moonie here on the show, Dr. Stephen Hodson, who's a cult expert. You probably know him. And they have like an arms factory. They're also a scary cult, right? Because they manufacture weapons legally in Korea, I think, and they sell them. And it's like, that's a powerful group. They can be a voting bloc. They're an arms dealer. And worst case, you can pay a president or a former president to come and speak at your organization for, I don't know, $300,000. And then you take video and photos and you just make it look like you're friends with whatever president is hanging out. And the cult leader's hanging out with Barack Obama, Donald Trump, George Bush. He must be a very important man. They don't know that you can just cut a friggin' check to a speaking agency and have that guy roll in and not care / not know that you are. I mean, you would think they would vet a cult like this, but at the end of the day, if they don't tell you it's for Children of God and they say it's for this business organization and the cult founder just happens to be there and everybody who's a member happens to be in this cult, they're not going to dig that far. They just don't do that. They wait for the check to clear and they book the flights.
Even as far as vetting goes, right? I have a top secret clearance and I grew up in an anti-American cult.
Yeah.
But
well,
you know, that's not how you brief it. You know, I'm like, I put down what I needed to put down. And I hope you're going to go get your Portuguese translators and go to Brazil and ask these people if you're really afraid. Right. And so there's a reason the first line of Uncultured is the first rule of cults is you're never in a cult. You know, it took me 2 years after I was out of the cult, watching a murder suicide on television, hearing Children of God cult over and over again, for me to recognize. And it's, most people just don't look that far, right? And the pretty, well-spoken children singing and dancing all in a row, like, goes a long way to fool people about what is going on behind the walls and the closed doors.
So even when you left the cult, you weren't thinking I'm in a cult? You just thought you were in a weird church?
Yeah, it was the family, right? Your whole life growing up, we were the family. We are the army of God. Everyone else is wrong. And the theory was, if you were born in the family, God has chosen you to grow up and to be a missionary. That's the only thing you were supposed to do. For me, actually, because I was so argumentative and so questioning, I would have usually older teenagers, so older kids born in the cult, would like exasperatedly say to me, oh, you need to be a lawyer. So by the time I was 6 years old, I was like, okay, I'm going to leave the family. I'm going to be a lawyer. And, you know, I was being abused pretty terribly at the age of 6 and 7 and 8. And I was just like, I don't care if this is God or if I'm going to hell not being in the family, hell's going to suck, but I'm not doing this.
Right.
So yeah, to me, it wasn't that different than any teenager, I think, wanting to get out of home. It was, or wanting to leave their parents' church. It just encompassed our whole lives. And the way I briefed it to myself was just, I want to go to high school so I can go to college so I can be a lawyer. So I have to get out of here. And so it wasn't until I uprooted my whole life, got myself excommunicated 2 years later. And, you know, the other part was, not only did we not call ourselves a cult, we spent hours and hours and hours drilling on how to answer questions if we were a cult, on how to, you know, to the point that when I had this realization, oh, we grew up in a cult, my next thought was, well, that should be obvious if you spend that much time talking about how you aren't a cult.
Right. Tell us about what kinds of questions you were being drilled on and what this was for. I mean, is this like, okay, when the police eventually raid this commune, we need you to be like, no, of course I've been to the doctor. Of course I'm not sleeping with a 72-year-old man. I'm only 12. I mean, is that, where are we going with this kind of training that you had?
Yes, that was exactly it. And actually, for listeners, the chapter 3 shows this, and it's published in Rolling Stone, a sample chapter. People can go check it out. And it was exactly right. We had, so first of all, you have the concept of the persecution, right? The persecution is coming, it is out there, and we have proof because XYZ, right? Which when I was a child was this compound in Argentina gets raided. And so after that, they're really coming. They really are what the prophet said. They really are out to get us. This is the same time Waco has just, you know, the Branch Davidians have erupted in Waco. So we are all terrified that they're going to decide we're a cult and come kill us all. And we have this doctrine called deceivers yet true, which is literally, it's not okay to lie, but it is okay to lie for God to the outsiders. And there would be all of these examples from the Bible and from, you know, Christian history. It was a cartoon book that my stepfather illustrated that we would read and drill on. And kind of exactly what you said about the touching and the sexual abuse, but also very similar to what they say in the movie Women Talking, which is, we didn't talk about what happened, so we didn't have language for it. So in the Children of God, there was no such thing as sexual abuse because you were supposed to give your body to whoever wanted it. We had a comic called Heaven's Girl that literally trained us how to give our body to multiple attackers in the end times, right? Antichrist soldiers, you know, training children and young teenagers about gang rape. So even though, you know, it wasn't until way later on when they put this charter of rules and responsibilities that I even had the language for, oh, grown men are not supposed to have sex with young girls.
The training that you got for relating to outsiders makes sense, right? And for people who don't know what Waco Branch Davidian was, because you're maybe young or weren't watching the news, this was a cult in Waco, Texas. There was, of course, another prophet named David Koresh, or, you know, self-proclaimed prophet named David Koresh. They all lived in a compound, and I believe, I'm going off memory here, but they were stockpiling weapons, which is a great way to get attention from the FBI. And so they got attention, or the ATF and the FBI, and the FBI said, all right, we're going to go in there and we're going to get the weapons. And the cult said, come and get it. And that was, then the FBI went in there and accidentally, through gross incompetence, basically killed almost everybody who was in this house. After they had let go of a bunch of women and children, but actually the FBI raided it, the place caught on fire, and they all burned to death. And it was not a good, I think a lot of my friend who works at the FBI was saying it's basically known as the worst sort of low point in the FBI because they bungled it so bad that they just ended up murdering all these people, and it was a complete accident. I mean, accident through negligence and incompetence and not knowing what the hell they were doing. And there's all this footage of like an FBI tank running into the side of the building and the place is on fire and there's people on the roof. It's just a huge mess. So using that as propaganda for your cult and saying, look, they're going to come and kill us, they did this on purpose, is kind of, I hate to say a stroke of genius because that's probably laying it on a bit too thick, but it really was a gift from the FBI to every cult out there that, look, all these lies we made up about how people are going to come after us, they turned out to be true. And here's the proof.
And it was perfect both siderism on our part. It was, we are not a cult. Waco was a cult. He said he was Jesus, right? He clearly is messed up. Our guy doesn't say he's Jesus. Our guy says he's the prophet, right? So we are not a cult, but look what America will do to you if they think you're a cult, right? And that is the other thing, is that we were trained to hate America. We were trained that America was Babylon the whore. It was going to be part of God's judgment. This is why we didn't live in America. Also because it's much, much easier to leave your cult if you live in the country that you are from, or nearby it, as I would find out later. But, so all of these things in my mind when I'm 6, 7, 8 years old is, I want the cops to come rescue me, but I don't want to be murdered. I don't want to be here, but also the outside world is evil. We aren't a cult, but we are like them. So we have to be careful.
Oh, the double think is very 1984, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to, unfortunately, I think we do have to talk about the abuse because it's a big part of the cult, right? We talked about the sexually liberated children concept, which is gross just even saying out loud. And it wasn't just sexual abuse, right? There was spanking babies as young as 6 months old. And there was a punishment culture. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So, in this way, I think it was very similar to many of the kind of strict evangelical churches that you have out there that are very into spare the rod, spoil the child. It's one of the primary doctrines. He says that babies should start being spanked at 6 months old, but we also don't have any limitations on spanking or hitting, right? So it just becomes sessions of beatings. We had a lot of group discipline, which of course I would later also encounter in the Army, because group discipline is a great way to, control people, because you are creating fear and you're creating this dynamic of kind of North Korean prison camps, right? Like everyone's going to tell on everyone else. People don't want to be disciplined, or people do, you can get back at the group by getting everyone disciplined. So you also can never bond and have good friends because of the discipline culture. And then, of course, we would get separated. So there would be a lot of isolation. There would be this thing called silence restriction, where they would just tell you that you couldn't talk. A lot of times they would hang signs on you. I now have T-shirts that say, "Don't talk to me, I'm disrespectful."
Wow.
But these are signs that they would put on, and you would go for a week, and everyone in the commune essentially knew they were supposed to shun you.
Wow.
And then, with the isolation. So there's a scene in Uncultured where I go there, right? Where I take you into 10 hours in the basement with a pedophile who, from the outside, I have done something bad and I have been hauled away for discipline, and I emerge 10 hours later and it's never talked about. Of course, what is happening on the inside is very, very serious rape and abuse and beatings and neglect, but it's not talked about. But I know that everyone else goes through this. I know that even my own mother grew up in this and has been isolated. So I think everybody knows what is happening. And I think that this is just the raping is just another part of my punishment from God, as the beating or the washing the mouth out with soap.
How do you know that everybody else went through that? I mean, it was clear that they did, but if you didn't ever talk about it, did you just know that somebody was missing for a while and you're like, well, they're probably going through the same thing as me because they went in the basement with creepy Uncle Jerry?
Yes. And, come to find out, everyone is, of course, not going through the same thing, right? And this is another way that survivors sometimes don't support each other. In the beginning, their sexuality stuff was very, very open. And then at some point, actually, when a 14-year-old got pregnant with me, they realized, we can't have this evidence, right? So we're going to put rules in place. And this is when a lot of the survivors seem to believe that telling the pedophiles to stop raping the children worked. And I find that I find it surprising that people believe that, of course, but that's where we were. So, but it was this culture of you don't question the uncles, right? Anything the uncles do, they are the hand of God. So, and when you know someone has been separated and then they come back, the last thing you want to do is ask them what happened, because somebody else might tell on you. They might tell on you, or heaven forbid, I think you just have to face what happened. And again, we didn't, have the words for that.
So even you asking somebody else what happened would be considered you questioning the uncle's decision to do sadistic stuff to kids.
Oh, absolutely. And, heaven forbid you ask someone what happened and then you react negatively, right? Because that would really be judgment, right? Things, something like rolling your eyes could get you isolated for days, right? So we absolutely walked on glass, and it wasn't until decades later, I feel like, that we would all start talking about it. And this was another really interesting parallel to my time in the military, because I feel like it was the same thing. All of the women are going through the same mistreatment and the same kind of abuse, but we don't talk about it. That's the number one rule.
Some of the punishment that you describe in the book, aside from, of course, I can't believe I'm saying this, aside from the child rape, some of the punishment was really sadistic. And it made me wonder, do you think the people that joined this cult were sociopathic pedophiles, or did they become that way when they joined the cult? Because I'm trying to figure out, it's like, if you offer me to join a cult and have some power, I'm like, oh, that's kind of appealing from a human. But if you're like, and you get to rape kids, I'd be like, dude, what? Ew, gross. So I would imagine these guys join because they get to do that with impunity. But I'm like, how did they advertise that? How do you find people that are going to be okay with that? And then you're like, hey, I got a secret. You can join this cult and do this all you want. That part I don't understand that. How do they... It's got to be part of the selling point to have these creeps join in the first place, right?
So, yes and no, right? So what we know about rape is it's not about sex, it's about power, right? So men primarily that get attracted to these patriarchal, high controlling, abusive religions, right? I don't think they have to know what the version of what they're going to be allowed to do is. It's just they're going to be given control. They're going to, be able to exercise their will over people. And I think, this is kind of what I call the difference between like the good uncles and the creepy uncles in the book. It's like there were some, like Uncle Jerry, like my biological father, who like were known to like young girls, right? And then there were many, I think, who went along with it when it was the thing to do. And then when it wasn't the thing to do anymore, they were like, okay, great. Now we can get back to loving God.
Wow. I've done shows on pedophilia, or in part on pedophilia. And one of the interesting paradoxes, I guess if you can call it that, is a lot of the guys, and it's usually guys, that offend, that's engage in sexual acts with children, they're not actually attracted to children. It's just because they have access to children and they are psychopaths or sociopaths or otherwise enjoy hurting other people. It has nothing to do in many ways with sexual attraction. There are adults, of course, who are attracted to kids, and it's a disorder, and many of them actually don't offend because they know it's bad. So a lot of the guys that do offend, they know that it's bad, that's what they like about it, and they couldn't care less if it's a child or an adult woman or whatever. They just don't care. It's about hurting somebody else.
Yes, and that's exactly the case. And, one of the other things, like the concept that I set out to write about in this book, is this group psychology concept that humans will do almost anything to fit in with groups that they've voluntarily chosen. And the Children of God had this very long-term, like 6-month onboarding process, very similar to how long it takes you to become a qualified soldier in the Army. And you didn't get to know any of the creepy doctrines until you had, already given up everything for 6 months. At that point, I think it becomes so much easier to justify things, to go along with things. And for all of the adults, they tell themselves, I'm this good person. And I have a chapter in my next book called There Were Good People in the Sex Cult too. Because even the ones that aren't the ones doing the actual abuses, right? They're reading the literature with all the naked children in it. They are seeing the things that are being done. They're seeing the children coming back out of the torture chambers, right? And they're not walking away. So there definitely is a point where even the good people in really toxic environments are complicit, even though they might also be abused and coerced.
Is there any element of blackmail? And I'm not trying to make this cult worse than it already is, but I would imagine, let's say I go and join some cult like this in South America, and I'm horrified at what's going on, and I realize that I'm complicit and I'm an accomplice to this horrible stuff that's going on. I almost would think maybe I can't leave, because what if I fly back to America? Is the cult going to be like, hey, this guy was around when all these bad things were happening. He's a criminal. I mean, I would, from a legal perspective, I definitely have criminal liability as a result of being around that and not doing anything about it.
So yes, what you're saying. A little bit, right? So in 93, someone went on Larry King Live and had this discussion, right? That he said, I didn't want to do this. They made me do it. And, he's talking about this 10-year-old girl that he was made to have sex with, who was the leader's daughter. And they did that to essentially have dirt on him. The 10-year-old girl was my mother. And he's trying to explain this, and he's trying to explain the coercive thinking, and it stands out because Larry King just looks at him and he goes, and you did it?
Mm-hmm.
And a few days later this man took his life. And I think the much more real threat here, and the exit cost, is not legally you are going to be pursued, but it's just nobody is ever, if you ever admit what it was really like and what was really done, nobody's ever going to accept you again, right? And that's really the worst punishment people can have. And that's what so many of us survivors, even that grew up in it, deal with. It's we live, for 10 years, I didn't say peep about it because I thought people would judge me so hard just from coming from that environment.
Now, I know this kind of stuff can be difficult to hear. Believe me, I understand. But we have a lot of podcasts on all kinds of topics, like this one if you're into serious stuff. But we have shows on lighter topics too. Emmy-nominated comedians, billionaire investors, Fortune 500 CEOs, and of course, organized crime figures, legendary Hollywood directors, Russian spies, arms traffickers, undercover agents, rocket scientists, neuroscientists, and more. So check out The Jordan Harbinger Show anywhere you find your podcasts. Now, back to the show. How did the cult instill fear of the outside world? We talked a little bit about how they're going to persecute us, but what were some of the other lies maybe that you had in place before Waco? Yeah, how did they keep you from seeing the doctor, for example? There had to be times where, people need medical care. For God's sake, you have people having kids all the time.
I think the biggest way they instilled the fear was just by absolutely not allowing us access to any of it, and so it wasn't just oh, they're bad, right? So we feared sugar, right? So white sugar wasn't just bad for you. It was the literal Antichrist. And we have, a band member of Fleetwood Mac singing a song about how bad sugar is for you. So then you go out in the outside world to perform to all these people, and you're seeing these evil systemites eating sugar and eating dessert in front of you, right? This will reinforce that what they're saying is true. You aren't allowed to see the doctor until it's a really, really extreme, horrible emergency. So the first time I'm taken to see the doctor, I have been bleeding for hours already. And so it is an extremely horrifying procedure. And so it reinforces to me, oh, doctors are evil. He did allow them to see doctors for having babies, although we did have both, like a lot of babies at home, but I don't think they wanted to get too complicated. But also we just had kids die a lot, as many cults do, just from neglect, medical neglect, and diseases that could have been prevented.
It sounded in the book like you ate a lot of stale or old food or not enough food. Why were you so poor? I mean, the flirty fishing and the women prostituting themselves, I guess maybe I should back up. How did the cult bring in money? Because it sounds like they weren't able to do enough of that.
Yeah, so nobody worked, quote unquote. Nobody worked for a legitimate company bringing in a salary. Everybody was expected to give 100% of their time and labor to what we called living by faith, which just meant go out and do it and God will provide. So what that really looked like, again, was, let's say like half of the commune was keeping the commune going, cooking, taking care of children, cleaning, all of the things. And we children were hugely part of that as well. And then the other half would be pounding the pavement, right? Begging at stoplights for money, performing, going around. Another thing in a lot of these developing nations is you'll have really big street markets. And so you have all kinds of food vendors with food that they need to get rid of by the end of the day. So it's the easiest thing to go by and get them to donate like almost bad food to your big giant missionary organization. So that was, just the situation. And I would say I grew up from that context better than many of the children in the Children of God, because we were in a leadership home that got money from the lower down home. So we were kind of like higher up on the MLM than a lot of people. And still there was just never enough food.
I know you got in trouble at some point for asking if the Bible was true. Can you talk to us about that? Because that seems like one of the things that when you're in a cult you should probably not do.
Yeah, I never got the memo of how to shut up. So I'm about 6 years old and we're playing Broken Telephone with one of our older cult kid teachers, like an 18-year-old that's in charge of us. And so we go through, it starts with a Bible verse that everyone knows. And I'm like, okay, how can this get screwed up? And then it goes through 10 children and it comes out completely ridiculous, as happens with Broken Telephone. And so we had been taught that the Bible was handed down by word of mouth from Adam for 500 years until it got to Moses, who then wrote it down, which is this very archaic, evangelical train of thought. And so when we first learned to play Broken Telephone, I just kind of piped up with, well, then how could the Bible possibly be true if it was handed down for 500 years, right? Just sort of
and we can't even do it for 20 minutes, right? That was your line of thinking, yeah.
And that was basically just my logic brain saying, well, like, is some of this maybe, been translated funny or things got twisted? And again, in a cult, like, that is not the kind of thing you can say. And so that was what led to the aforementioned, basement punishment. And these are the kinds of things that would happen just all the time.
Did you ever meet the cult leader, the grandpa figure, or was he kind of on the run? I couldn't really tell. It sounded like he was almost on the run at that point.
Yeah, so ever since the point in the 70s when the FBI was looking for him and he left the country, he not only lived in hiding from his own followers, but we didn't even see his face. So he communicated with all of us through endless written letters called the Mo letters, Moses David. And he always had over any picture was a cartoon lion's head that somebody like my dad would draw. I forget exactly why. Oh, he was the Lion of Judah or something. And the first time most of us saw his face was after he died. And this was, again, it was the reinforcing of the persecution, right? He's so important. They're so out to get him. And one of the things that always made me feel really special was that my mom had lived with him and knew what he looked like and had even married him when she was a teenager.
So weird. Where was he the whole time? If he wasn't living with you in Brazil and they raided the Argentina place, where was he?
So he was in the Philippines in the 80s, like 87 when I was born. He was nearby. I don't know where he was in the meantime. At some point, they were in Mexico. And then the rumor is that he died of syphilis in Portugal. And that his wife, when he got really bad, just left him there with one of his concubines to just die in pain and just went off and didn't tell anyone in the group. So I kind of hope that's the way he died, because it seems like justice.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How bizarre. It doesn't sound like he was exactly living it up. Because I sort of envisioned, if you've got an international cult, you're doing it wrong if you're not touring around and enjoying the fact that you've got homes in multiple countries. I mean, it seems like he should have figured that out. But I guess maybe the heat was up a little bit too high for cult grandpa.
Yeah, and definitely like in the leadership homes, there's always a cult inside the cult, right? So in the Children of God, that was the leadership homes. In Scientology, this is the Sea Org. In the U.S. Army, it's the Special Forces. But like the closer you get to the leader, like it always gets more serious and more extreme. But I feel like he definitely had this double life that he had to keep from most of the followers, so that they would continue to sacrifice their lives and their children and send him all their money and live in poverty. And the other thing is just like, nobody wins in power games. So like the patriarchy hurts women and children, but it hurts men too. And, or like, if you're going to keep a slave in the basement, you're still also tied to that house and that basement, right? So I think at some point, like his organization also held him almost as much of a prisoner as it did the other people.
Well, that's fascinating. I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. The slave metaphor, or in many cases not metaphor, I guess, is really apt here. It's so, some of the tales in the book are just so bizarre. Can you tell us about these weird over-sexualized parties that you had? Because it's so odd to read about this. And on the one hand, it's the Bible, but on the other hand, it's like something out of the movie Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah. So first of all, it wasn't just the parties, right? Our entire life was over-sexualized. And the reason they call it a sex cult was literally because sex was just our number one belief, right? So every poster that we had of angels flying around heaven, the angels were all either naked or in transparent white gowns with boobs hanging out, right? So it's, some of the survivors will be like, well, I didn't sort of specifically get sexually abused, and they won't understand that like everything in our vicinity was that. So we would have these, I show this party where there's adults walking around naked. So it's, instead of like a Halloween party, it's a heaven party. We dress up like people in heaven. And there are games, right? But it would be musical chairs. But when the music stops, you have to lose clothes, and the kids are just around, involved in all of this. There would be, they had this doctrine of loving Jesus, which was having sex with Jesus, which turned into like these big public orgies where they were all just making sex sounds and talking to Jesus. Again, in the middle of the living room, where everyone can kind of hear this and know this. And again, it's one of those things that people ask, how does nobody stop and question this?
Yeah.
But when that's so what everybody's doing, if you go to a nude beach in Europe and you're wearing clothes, you feel awkward. And so when everyone around you is naked and saying Jesus is love and, saying that Uncle Jerry's the coolest thing, nobody's questioning it.
And Uncle Jerry, this isn't just a random name that we made up. This is an actual guy. And he was what, like a rock musician who had somehow joined the cult. And he ended up with status because he had royalty checks coming in. So he had money. And this guy was, he sounds like a sadistic pedophile. Is that accurate? In
my opinion, yes. I think he was one of those ones that you talk about, just like from birth or from a very young age was a sociopath. Like he wasn't only a pedophile, he was very violent in a lot of ways. And yeah, he was, we were supposed to be in this society where there was no such thing as money, there was no such thing as rank, everyone was equal, everyone was the same. But somehow the people that, came in with a lot of money always seemed to get whatever they wanted, right? And he was a very significant musician with royalty checks that would do very well for the children of God for the rest of his life, and he's still there.
He's still there. I was going to ask, where is this guy now? Is he alive still?
Yes, as far as I know, he's self-publishing his own book quite soon.
Oh wow, I'm sure it's a fascinating read. I can't imagine. You thought getting your book published was tough. I would imagine self-publishing is the only way to go when you're a sadistic pedophile who runs a sex cult. The founder eventually dies, and I want to know how this changes things, but the mourning of his passing kind of reminded me a bit of North Korea, right? Where the leaders die and people go wild with this exaggerated show of mourning because, in part because other people are watching, but in part because they're so completely programmed and brainwashed that the crying, people always ask me, the North Korean, they're crying so hard because if they don't, they'll get in trouble. And I'm thinking they're crying so hard because they've been told their whole lives that this is actually a divine being that is responsible for their safety. They're actually really sad. It's real. It's just, it looks fake because nobody mourns like that. But you would if you thought your entire country was going to fall apart and everyone was going to die as a result of this man passing.
And what you're saying is so true, right? And we see this in a lot of ways with cults. Like the thinking is twisted, but the phenomenon that people are going through is real, right? Like when you chant in groups, you get into this hypnotic state, this suggestible state, like that feeling is real. It doesn't just happen in cults, but a cult can manipulate that, right? And so we called him Grandpa. Right? The adults that joined called him Dad, and we children called him Grandpa. That was the only thing we ever called him. And we were taught from birth that you didn't have your family, you had the family, right? So exactly what you're saying, right? So we were ushered into this room. There's a giant easel with this giant picture of this like super creepy old bearded white man. That all of the aunties are just crying and wailing. And for us, it is a little bit like, well, we've lost the most important person in our family. We've lost our patriarch. We've lost the head of whatever. But I also think for the children, it was like, yeah, but we also didn't know him. And, it was more like, how is this going to change now, right? What's going to happen? Is the family going to be over?
And you did eventually get uprooted, right? What happened there?
So, so his wife takes over and she's her own kind of crazy who's been indoctrinated by this man since she was a young teenager. And I think in some ways she tried to make it better for the children. And then in some ways she just also standardized a lot of things that were horrible. But she decided, we're not going to have these giant communes anymore. I think maybe she didn't want the work of, running 10,000 people in large brigades in a military fashion. And so it was, go out on your own, find 3 or 4 people that you can be in a home with, in a commune with, and go out and do your thing. And this is when we end up getting moved from the leadership home because my mom has had too many kids at this point, even though this is what you're supposed to be doing. And this, in a way, became like a really good thing that happened to me because we got into a much smaller commune and we interacted more in the population. And this is when, I remember I started learning Portuguese at 10 years old and I could speak before I was 11. And I remember thinking like, okay, I can do it now. Like I'm closer to my freedom because I can speak the language, because I know where I am on a map, because, I go outside the walls more often than I did before.
So when did you know you wanted to leave the cult? Because it sounds like that happened really early.
So when I was 6, I was like, I'm not going to grow up and do this. I'm going to leave the family. When I was 11, I started trying to make my plans. So that's when I actively was like, I need to get out of here. But because my whole family, including my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles, everyone are in the cult, I didn't have a lot of options and just thought I had to wait till 18. When I finally had my definite crack in the brainwashing moment was on 9/11. We've just come to the US for the first time. I'm 14 years old, watching live news on television. First, I have to understand what live news is, because of course we've all been taught to hate the news and mistrust the media, all the things that are going on in the country now. And I hear, my people around me are praising God, right? This is God's promised judgment on America. This is what's been coming. This is what our prophet told us. And I'm just watching this horrible carnage and destruction and wondering to myself, are we the bad guys here? And I hear the term religious extremism as they're talking about the terrorists. And that was like a moment that just stood out to me as probably the first time I questioned not just, is this for me, but like, is this actually bad? Are we actually not good people? And then from there, I was like, I'm done. And this became my 1.5-year campaign to get myself excommunicated. And this for me was really important before I turned 16, because when you turned 16, you were now considered essentially old enough to get pregnant, right? So an adult, and people usually women didn't usually stay pregnant for very long, girls I should say, stay unpregnant for very long once they turned 16. So I was like, I need to get out of here. And I realized, if they think they can save you, they will try, and exorcisms are not fun. So you have to do the worst thing. So for me, this was literally climbing over the commune walls in the middle of the night and going and having sex with a boy that I had met in the outside world. Because, they'd gone from being the religious prostitution cult to AIDS, close the doors because we all have sex with each other. The biggest sin is going outside. So
interesting.
Once I had done that, it was essentially, now you're untouchable. Now we just need to get you out of here before you infect anyone else. Yeah,
literally. Interesting. Wow. Were they at all, the irony is rich with them being so afraid of getting a disease. I mean, there's where to even start poking holes in the logic that is cult thinking, right? How did you end up going to the United States? Because it seems like that would be a radical change. There's no walls. There's no guards with automatic rifles. You can read the signs. People are speaking English around you. That must have been insane.
Biggest culture shock I've ever had in my life. So we left Brazil. Just my mom wanted to get out of there and she kept insisting. And we eventually left and we spent a few months in the US. And it really was that, Jordan, right? It was like the walls came down. And I remember thinking over and over again, wow, in the 8 months that we lived in a commune in the US, like, oh, this is why they don't want us in the US, right? Like, you cannot be panhandling on the streets in the middle of the day. An American will walk up to you and say, why aren't you in school? That doesn't happen in Brazil. People can't be walking around the commune half naked all the time when it's a house that you can see right into. And so the walls coming down, like you said, I can speak the language, all of this stuff. And so for most of us, when we left the cult, we just went back to wherever we had ties to, which for a lot of people was like the US, Australia, the UK. And I didn't have any of that, but I did have a stepfather with a daughter in Houston, Texas. I'd met her 3 times before. And, she'd left the cult about 3 years before, 25-year-old living in Houston trying to survive. And they were like, hey, do you want a 15-year-old? And she said, sure. And so my parents... Who
was they? The cult asked her if she wanted it, or the American authorities asked her?
No, my parents. my dad.
Your parents were like, hey, take your crazy sister who's causing trouble.
And this is kind of what we did, right? Her older sister had already taken the 3 younger sisters of my dad's. And, now it was her turn to take the next one. And when my 16-year-old brother wanted to get out of home, he came and lived with me for a while I was a lieutenant in the Army. Like, this was kind of what we did, how we tried to help each other, I guess.
Sure.
And we just, this is life in high control religions, right? Your parents just kick you out if you don't believe like them. And so I was 15 years old, $0 for about 3 weeks. Went to enroll in high school. I had a social security card and a passport. And they were like, so we can't enroll you because you don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But also, now that we know you exist, we need to see proof that you're in school somewhere in 5 days, or else we need to call the cops.
It's a little catch-22.
So
you can't come to our school, but you need to be in school.
Right. It was a process. It took me about a month to get enrolled in school. And, and then after that, I went to high school, I worked, I got through it all. And fortunately, I had a counselor see me, identify I needed help, and really change my life in many ways.
But also, tell me about your experience at an American high school after leaving a sex cult. That must have been freaking crazy, because you're going to an American high school, and we're kind of a puritanical society, despite what a lot of people might say, and you're going in there, and just the people sitting next to you in language arts class are just not ready for Daniella Mestyanek at all.
No, and neither was I ready for it, right? So I went from nothing, right, being no schooled, living in a commune, to 4,000 students in an inner city Houston high school, right? So it was, the only thing I knew about school came from She's All That, right, or high school movies. And I remember, I was worried about being bullied or not accepted. What I was not prepared for was you're just completely ignored, right? And you just cannot make contact with anyone. To your point, everything I say is wrong. It's messed up. I don't have any classmates that I knew of that are living on their own, working 40 hours a week, just coming from a sex cult. America's so Christian. It still surprises me to this day, because we were taught that you all were fire-breathing agents of the end of the world, and America's very Christian. Yeah. And my version of Christianity was, like you said, like nobody, you come up with your parents are missionaries, but also at 16 you're having sex. People don't know what category to put you in.
Right. So you're the devil, but we're doing all the things that you guys say is bad, but then also you can't add things together because not only does the math not work, you're trying to add fruits and vegetables into it. It's like this, you can't make it work. There's no assembly of anything that's going to fit.
And, for sure the hardest thing is just, what's one of the first questions people say is, where are you from? And it's still a hard thing for me in my life, right? Because I am from this cult. I am not from anywhere. I grew up in Brazil, but I didn't have a normal Brazilian life. I don't know hardly anything about America at this point. I was relieved 6 years later to find out that all of America was not like Texas.
Texas isn't that bad. I mean, I guess it might be if you're in a crazy rural area where nobody ever leaves, the hills have eyes kind of place. But I feel like people throw a lot of shade on Texas. I even do it, and people write it and they're like, you should come down here. It's not that bad. It's not. But it is not like the rest of America. I'll give you that.
Yeah, it's an interesting place, so it's interesting to have this very evangelical experience of everyone you're meeting are these evangelical Christians, but you've been told these people are evil. And honestly, one of the beliefs I think that I absorbed the most from the cult, and that I've had to fight the hardest at throughout these last 20 years, is this idea that the outside world is evil. And writing part of writing Uncultured for me, part of the process was kind of taking off all of this armor that I put on and realizing probably didn't need most of it. And that was the part I couldn't see through their lives, right? Was the nobody out there is going to love you. You're never going to belong anywhere. And when you try to integrate and try to be like, I'm here, I want to be this normal kid, and everyone treats you like you're really, really strange, you're like, oh, maybe they were right. Maybe I don't fit anywhere.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you didn't even have time to fit in anywhere. You said you had 3 or 4 jobs at once. What kind of jobs were you working during high school?
So in high school, I first got a job at Chick-fil-A, and then
which is also somehow appropriate, right? Because it's run by the evangelical crowd. Interesting choice.
Right. It was one of the few places that would hire you before you were 16. There's a lot of interesting things about Chick-fil-A and control. Anyways,
I'm all ears. Wait. Don't just jump ahead. What are you talking about? I want to hear about this.
Okay. So, Chick-fil-A is known to pay people better than any of their competitors.
I heard about that.
And in return, you are expected to always be smiling, to always say my pleasure anytime someone says thank you. And there's this whole code of ethics for working at Chick-fil-A, right? That is supposedly like this very strong culture. And I'm not necessarily saying it's bad, but it would result in things like my manager walking up to me and be like, why aren't you smiling today? We hired you because you have a pretty smile.
Oh, wow.
And it being like, I don't know why I'm not smiling today, right? But this sort of attitude policing. Just last year, when that story about how Chick-fil-A was asking people to volunteer in return for free food. Did you hear this one?
I did, but I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, I was
volunteer
just like,
for
this
what?
does not. It was to volunteer to work at Chick-fil-A, like handing out samples or like advertising in return for food. Just like, we'll let you eat for free. And people were like, oh yeah, this is like a great thing that Chick-fil-A is doing. And I was just like, I think Chick-fil-A has their hand a lot further in the power and control games than an ordinary fast food place.
That's interesting. And you saw that right away because you're like, hey, this reminds me of the cult that the literal cult that I grew up in has similar practices, and they do these very specific things, and nobody else is really seeing it because they didn't have the insane childhood that I did.
Yes. And not only did I see it right away, but I was good at it, right? And this is going to be the same thing in the military. Like, I am good at being attitude policed and just smiling no matter how I feel like, and just saying my pleasure even though I want to strangle you, and, doing all the things like the Army is going to want you to do. So to me, this was my basic skill. I could do this. I could fit in wherever. Ended up, there was a law firm above the mall. And so I ended up getting hired by someone who knew me from Chick-fil-A and was like, you always have a great attitude. We're looking for data clerks. And so, then I got paid $8 or $9 an hour and went to high school in suits, which didn't make me more popular.
Right. No, that's not a great way to fit in with the other kids, is wearing a pantsuit to school because you have to go to your law firm job afterwards instead of cheerleading practice. At what point did you start? Oh, go ahead.
I was saying that in college, I got really creative and started actually using things that the cult taught me. So I could, babysit for $10 an hour, but I could make balloon animals for $250 an hour at a child's party. And every once in a while, I bust them out at my own kid's party now. And people are always like, how did you learn this? And I'm like, I was once a teenage carnival clown in Mexico, in another life.
Does. Right.
Could sing, could dance, ended up teaching chess, right? I get trained on how to play chess in college and end up teaching kids chess that pays a lot of money. And of course, waiting tables, so all the things.
Gosh, at what point did you start thinking, hey, maybe I should be a normal teenage girl? Did that ever even happen? Or were you like, hey, that's never going to happen for me. Why bother?
No. There was no point. And I specifically was not trying to be a normal teenage girl. So a lot of my peers and siblings who left the children of God would kind of go wild. And I was very, very afraid. Looking back now, I know it's because I have an addictive personality and I had a lot of trauma, but I went into perfectionism instead, right? So I just have to work hard. I just have to, make perfect grades, do all the right things, and kind of eventually my life's going to be good. Eventually I'm going to outrun the trauma. Don't think about it. Don't talk about it. I didn't know how to be a normal teenage girl. I just liked being in school. Really, once I got to college and I was able to major in reading books and writing about books, I was like, okay, this is lovely.
Yeah, I remember you wrote in your book that books were kind of a forbidden thing in the cult, and you just longed for books, which no kid generally does, or few kids generally do, I guess you would say.
It was, one of the things with my imposter syndrome was, so now I'm in college, I'm studying literature. Everyone around me has been reading whatever they can lay their hands on since they were 3. And I have, again, no sort of knowledge to build on, except every literature class starts with the Bible. And I was good at that, right? And it turns out like every story concept you can find in the Bible, right? And that we have been trained since birth on kind of micro analyzing sentences and making up things about them. So, one of the things we would have to do in the cult was read all the drivel from this quote unquote prophet and then write these reactions and responses about how it moved us. So basically spiritual journaling. And I was good at that, right? And this was how I passed a bunch of the tests I needed to pass in high school to get out of classes. This is, I used to say in college, like when you don't know how to answer the question, you just write 2 more pages and the teacher forgets that you didn't answer the question. And
that's funny.
I was always surprised that this worked, but I think sometimes they would be like, well, she writes this good. She's smart.
That's funny. I was terrible at English class, which is interesting now because I read like 2 or 3 books a week. And back then it's like, whose story is it? And I'm like, what do you mean? No, that's your whole prompt. And I'm like, I'm going to just fail this class now. But if you're used to reading into something where there is frankly nothing because it's the demented ramblings of an old pedophile, it's like, well, I got this. There's at least something to chew on here. There's a throwaway line in your book where you say you started burning yourself with cigarettes and you say, well, at least I felt something. I assume you had to work through that trauma in some way.
Yeah. Still working through it. I say that I really connected with the term disassociation when readers told me that I described disassociation really well in my book. And I was like, oh, maybe that's the thing. I did a lot of self-harming kinds of things that we would consider actually self-harming. And then things I think for me that were doing it to myself, right? So running your body until you pass out or until you have barely any weight on you can be just as much of a way of punishing yourself as other things that we would consider self-harm. And that was one of the things I think that I fell into. And I have had to work a lot now on staying in my body, staying with your emotions, feeling, when you go through this much, I think, pain and trauma in your life, you survive it by going away, going out of your body. Most of us describe it in the same way, right? We're up in the ceiling watching, feeling bad for this poor little girl. That was actually a big part of how I was able to write the book, is that it doesn't feel necessarily like it happened to me. It feels like it happened to this character in my life, because that is how I survived it. And so a big part of my work today is staying in your body, feeling the feelings, being present, right? I know we all deal with that, just constantly wanting to be busy. And
yeah.
cults
well, you're knitting right
program
now
that
as we do the show. And I wondered I wondered if that's, is this a coping strategy or she just loves knitting and she's like, I'm not setting aside an hour and a half talking to this yutz without knitting.
It's both. So ADHD, I actually focus more on what you're saying if I'm knitting.
I get it.
But also I will be tearing my fingers if I'm not doing something with my hands. Right. So
I knew it had to be something like that because I'm thinking I've seen a lot of stuff during the interview. Knitting, whatever you're knitting. What is that, by the way? What are you making?
I'm making a sweater dress and it has like a really fancy cable pattern and everything.
It does. Yeah. No, I like it. I'm joking because I'm actually not offended by this at all. And I think it's quite nice because I probably at some level am the same way where I need to find something where I can fidget while doing the show because I'm always going, oh, I should look at my phone. And I've been doing this for 15, 16 years and I know not to check my friggin' email during a show. And I'm always pulled to it. Maybe I should start knitting. I can't imagine doing it.
And now we talk about this, right? So I'm teaching, I crocheted this shirt, by the way, too. So I'm teaching crochet and knitting at my daughter's school. And I tell all the parents, I'm like, it's a great fidget tool.
Yeah.
You know, now we talk about this. We didn't talk about this when we were young, but now I think people are starting to have better ideas about it.
Back then it didn't make any sense, but even now, like when I'm reading audiobooks or listening to audiobooks, I got to be walking, I got to be tinkering with a remote control car or doing something. Sitting and reading is just about the most painful thing that I can think of. I mean, I'm sure waterboarding is bad, but like sitting around and reading a book is just brutal and I can't do it. So I'm with you on the knitting. I think it's brilliant. So I know we're running out of time here. The cult is still around. Where is it? Do you track this at all?
Okay, so in 2009, they kind of fell apart from the form they had. And this was really the realization of the people running it, that all of their joiners were getting old and most of the children that they had tried to bring up as the new army of God were not sticking around. So they just kind of were like, hey, all that stuff we've told you forever about dropping out of the world, like psych, go put your kids in school and go, you have all these people like my dad who's 70 now and has been working for them or my stepdad has been working for them for his whole life, and what is he going to do? So most of the people that hadn't left yet, my parents had already left, but most of the people that hadn't left yet kind of had their awakenings then. And they were like, nah, we're going to go do our own thing. But there still is a core of about 1,500 members. My grandfather still runs the money. They still bring in about $1 million a year. And it's an online thing. I think most of their active members are in Thailand and Brazil and, places that are not, places that are still easier to hide cults in.
Yeah, and maybe have weaker rule of law and or corruption. Because I'm guessing at some level, cops do knock and go, hey, what is this? Oh, we're definitely a bunch of white people doing sketchy stuff. And it's like, if you want us to pretend we don't see this, you're going to have to pay a visit to the chief of police and maybe drop off a package every now and then.
Yeah. And also drop off some beautiful women.
Oh,
so
gosh.
the religious prostitution at one point got turned off, but somehow all of the women that were in relationships with police and politicians got the special permission to keep those relationships going, right? So like there was a woman in Rio who had 8 kids with a man who was very high up in the federal police and like had a wife, had his whole own life and just had 8 kids, but like donated probably 15 giant properties to the Children of God throughout Rio and different parts of Brazil, right? So lots of power, lots of connection. And certainly in Brazil, they were very involved with trafficking and corruption in much more blatant ways than has ever really been talked about.
Yeah, that part's interesting. We didn't even get to talk about that. I had so many questions about that, but maybe for next time. How do they recruit now, and how large is it? Do you have any idea?
I think now it's about 1,500 members.
Okay.
I don't honestly know that they are recruiting or what they are doing. I think they tried to just become this online church. Please send us money. Just the last of the people that can't really admit that's what it was. And then many of like our parents and grandparents just are still in whatever country they were in, just living on the economy, making balloons, doing their missionary work, or they found other churches to fold up into, etc. Many people just are like, well, I can teach English and live in this country that's cheaper. And so that's what they do now.
Does cult programming ever come out in your life now? Do you ever see some weird influence from the cult childhood pop up and you're like, oh, that's the cult talking, or that's the cult making me think this way?
100%. So I think first of all of the reasons that I joined the Army were probably the same reasons my grandfather joined the Children of God. I think that I hate to be idle, right? I have to remind myself that it is okay to just like sometimes lie around and watch television. Like I always think I have to be productive and be doing something and be accomplishing something. So that perfectionism, which is, of course is the opposite of self-love, definitely is still in my life. And then something I've just recently realized is like sort of so it's 20 years exactly since I walked away from the cult. And I've been searching for a mentor that will give me guidance, tell me exactly what I should do with my life. And I've only recently found out like that's a cult leader. And my kind of desire sometimes to find an expert or to not have to make my own choices, like that is a cult programming thing. And one of the things, it wasn't until I had written Uncultured, I was at Harvard studying social identity theory, group behavior theory, that I realized, oh, I never got to form a personal identity. That is what we're doing between the ages of 1 and 6.
You didn't forget. You weren't allowed to.
Right. I went cult to perfect student in college to perfect soldier in the Army to finally, I feel like I'm developing my own personality along with my daughter, and I say, for example, I love thrift stores because you have to go in and there's no messaging. Like in a mall, they're messaging you what you should be wearing. In a thrift store, you have to look at this and be like, do I love this or do I hate this? And I think one of the good things in my life is that losing everything, at 15 has meant that I have to be very deliberate about every single thing in my life because I don't have any models to go on. So everything I bring in, every way we decide to raise our children, anything, it's like I have to investigate it. I have to be open-minded. And then I have to go find people to like teach me the right ways to do things. And that's been kind of cool, like hard, but cool, and a good way to connect with people too.
I assume your kids don't have any contact with anybody who's in your extended family because that family, they're still in the cult, right? Or have you been able to balance that somehow?
So most of my family is not anymore.
Okay.
And like I have a very good relationship with my mom. She and I both have kind of done decades of work, I feel like, on understanding what has happened. And my mom left about a decade after me. So I've been a bit of a mentor in that process for them. And I have 25 siblings. So some of them I talk to and many of them don't want to have anything to do with me because they're not ready to have their background outed. So that has been, I think anytime you speak out about things that happened in your family, you're going to end up losing some family.
Yeah, well, especially this kind of stuff. Well, Daniella, you're a fascinating person. This is a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate how open you are about all this. I really enjoyed your book, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And to any of your listeners, I am on TikTok. We talk about cult stuff and where it shows up in the regular world all the time. So Daniella Mestyanek Young on TikTok. Would love to see you there. And yeah, check out the book. The New York Times says the audio is kind of good.
Yeah, we'll link to all that in the show notes. It's interesting. I'm not on TikTok, but I would imagine I would look at a TikTok channel for cult stuff. That's for sure. Cult stuff showing up in the real world. Can you give us an example of that, actually?
Yeah. So one of my this will be a whole chapter of my next book, right? So
Sure.
in cults, every time a cult blows up on the news, there's always this skinny white woman who's right next to the cult leader, right? These are your Ghislaine Maxwell's, these are your Allison Max of Nexium. You know, our cult had the white woman that took over. And as I'm thinking about this, right, and it's because her presence, the stereotype of the white woman, the pure white woman and everything that entails, is kind of whitewashing the sins of the leader, right? So she's always there. She's always dedicated. Her skinniness is about self-sublimation. And that's exactly who you want next to you in a sex cult, is that woman, right? She ran the marriage ceremony to the leader. You see this in regular organizations. You see, you know, I think I played this role unwittingly sometimes in the Army of like, well, we can't be sexist because look, we have Captain Mestyanek up here, right? So we see this woman, this stereotype in all these places around us. Another example would be like you said about, or like we talked about earlier about the chanting, right? So we think of cults and we think of chanting. And if we know the research that shows that it makes us susceptible chanting in groups, right? We see that in sports. We see that in political rallies. We see that in school when the children have to do the pledge. You know, there's music that's like that. And so this is what my next book is called, The Culting of America. And I'm looking at like all these different things about group behavior that I see in the cult, I see in the Army. So I know they're sort of about programming and influence or power and control. But a group doesn't have to be a cult for it to be using these toxic methods of control or for it to be having these influences on you. And sometimes I think it's so comforting for people to be able to say, well, that's a cult and my group is not. And, you know, that's not how bad stuff works.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, we'll have to have you come back for that. When is that out? You're still writing it, I assume.
Yes, still writing it. So no dates on that. But
well, you let
everybody
me know.
does seem interested. So hopefully soon.
You know, cult stuff, cult of America. I mean, you're putting the pieces together in a way that's definitely really interesting. Thank you once again, and we'll link to all of your work in the show notes so people can follow up.
Thanks so much, Jordan. This has been great.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.